Good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Hunker, and I'm a policy analyst here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation Center for Economic Freedom. I first would like to welcome everybody to the Texas Public Policy Foundation's 12th annual policy orientation, and specifically to our afternoon panel, Consumer Protection or Burden, Regulation of the Marketplace. In almost every policy area, whether it be the electricity market, homeowners insurance, or payday lending, government actors find themselves in a dilemma on how to best protect consumers. Do they trust the voluntary cooperation of the market and the savviness of market actors, or do they impose rules that they believe best reflect the interests of consumers? Of course, each choice has its own potential pitfalls. As regulators and self-described consumer groups are quick to point out, consumers are harmed by fraudulent practices, and post-injury litigation sometimes feels like an inadequate remedy given far too late. At the same time, any attempt to regulate on behalf of consumers opens the Texas government to the perils that accompany intervention in the marketplace. Namely that one, the regulatory process will be captured by industry special interests, which views consumer protection as a pretext for acquiring a benefit or subsidy at the expense of all taxpayers, including consumers. This is something we are seeing now at the Texas Public Utility Commission in the debate over the capacity market, where generators are content that they need $4 billion in government subsidies in order to protect consumers from avoiding blackouts. Two, the regulatory process gets it wrong, and the disruption of price signals, along with the inflexibility of settled law, force businesses to raise prices, cut services, and take away what we at the Foundation believe to be the greatest protection consumers have, and that is choice. In worst case scenarios, these regulations could even prevent companies from offering products altogether, potentially depriving consumers of much needed services. And this is a fear that is voiced in regards to consumer lending and payday loans, which for some Texans represent their only way to access cash in cases of emergencies. And three, the ensuing regulations only reflect the interests of certain constituencies, obliging everyone to subsidize the lifestyle and choices of the most influential voters, and saddling everyone else with a service they otherwise wouldn't choose at a price they otherwise wouldn't pay. This last pitfall frequently occurred in the homeowners insurance market, where restrictions on non-renewal of high claim policies and a bloated residual market create artificial incentives to reside in coastal areas and other high-risk areas. So how does the Texas legislature navigate the minefield that is consumer protection? How do they establish a body of law that is both respectful to consumer interests and the competitive principles that has made Texas the lead job creator in the country? Well, that's what we're here to find out. We have gathered a great panel for you today with legislators and leading advocates for reform. Each will come up, give their philosophy on consumer protection, offer their advice on how to ensure that the Texas government avoids the aforementioned pitfalls when issuing regulations, and then apply those principles in policy areas in which they have an expertise. Each panelist will have 12 minutes and will be able to respond to questions as soon as they're all done. To start, we have Senator Larry Taylor. Senator Larry Taylor represents Senate District 11. He is Vice Chairman of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee and a member of the Senate Education, Government Organization, and Health and Human Services Committee. Before his election in the Texas Senate in 2012, Senator Taylor served 5 terms in the Texas House of Representatives. During his tenure there, Senator Taylor served as Chairman of the House Elections Committee and Co-Chairman of the Windstorm Insurance Legislative Oversight Board. Senator Taylor is proud to have been named Taxpayer Advocate by Texans for Fiscal Responsibility and a champion of free enterprise by the Texas Association of Business. He was also named Texas Legislative Champion by Celine Smith Foundation for his efforts to repair the University of Texas Medical Branch after Hurricane Ike. A native Texan, Senator Taylor attended Baylor University where he received his BBA in 1982. He and his wife Carrie are the proud parents of 3 adult children. Senator Taylor owns Truman Taylor Insurance in Friendswood, an independent agency started by his father more than 50 years ago. Senator Taylor?
Thank you. Well, thank you, and I definitely had a PowerPoint presentation. And I apologize if my voice quality is not there. I've been suffering through the cedar. I started off last week, and I was hunting, went home for a couple of days recovering. I came back up here last night and started recurring again, so bear with me on that. Consumer protection. Yeah, I am a free market. And you've heard me say this many times. I'm a big believer in the free market and competition. I think that's the ultimate consumer protection is when people are actually competing for your business. you will get the best product, service, and price at the end of the day when they're actually a free market and allowed to compete. And because of that stating, a lot of times folks in my party and people like me are not exactly portrayed as protectors of consumers. We have groups that are consumer protection groups, and typically folks in the other party tend to portray themselves as protector of consumers. So when I look around at some things that are happening today, I have to tell you I'm a little surprised at what's going on. I'm not going to start off right off the bat, a little bit different probably the take that you were thinking we were going to go on this, but the Affordable Care Act. The way that's been rolled out, and we have these navigators, and what's going on there. One thing we've heard a lot about here of recent times is privacy and people stealing people's identities and all these other types of things going. Well, in the state of Texas, which is normally states have been the purveyors of regulation of insurance within the states, it was not a federal thing, and there were a lot of protections put in there to take care of consumers. Here we have this rollout of Affordable Care Act, and under the Navigator program, I'm not sure if you've heard of it following the story, but the Navigators, very little regulation of how they're allowed to be the purveyor of this information about the Affordable Care Act, and they're interacting with people and actually getting very private information. And frankly, the federal government did little to consider what kind of care they were going to do for consumers. Very little education. In fact, the insufficiencies of federal standards, no background check is required. No fingerprint like we do for insurance agents here in Texas for them to be able to do this for folks. We have laws in place to protect consumers from bad actors. There's none of that in the Affordable Care Act and the way it's been rolled out. They're not required to pass any tests to get a license. So you can have absolutely no knowledge of what's going on. And if your group gets approved to be a navigator, you're out there talking to people and helping them make healthcare decisions, and also getting some of their very private, most private, I would say, information with no protections being provided by the federal government. There's no, like I said, with the background check, you can actually have criminals doing this. In fact, Secretary Sebelius has even admitted the federal laws don't prevent criminals, ex-cons, whatever, from providing this service for people here in the state of Texas. So I joined together with the Texas Conservative Coalition here recently in supporting the Texas Department of Insurance. We passed a bill last session that allowed us to come in and add more protections for Texas consumers. And we've gotten some pushback on that, which I find unfortunate, but these are the things we've required for years and years of insurance agents who are doing this very same thing. And so we're really trying to do what's being done there. So once again, the folks who normally would think of as being the protectors of consumers in the definition that we hear so often have done a miserable job of doing that thing on the Affordable Care Act. And then I'll move to something else, which I've been involved with now for a number of years. And it has to do with some of the other folks who portray themselves as protectors of consumers, particularly the plaintiff trial lawyers. I mean, you hear all the time, they're out there taking care of consumers, and that's their purpose. And I'm the first one to tell you, I am in full support of a plaintiff's lawyer taking on a legitimate case and making sure people are taken care of. That is a legitimate role, and that's what we need folks like that to do. Unfortunately, that's not what happens a lot out there in the civil justice system. And we've seen here recently in the state of Texas with the, not just right recently, but we've had a series of these things over the years. If you'll remember, workers' comp. Workers' comp is a no-fault system. You get hurt at work, you get paid for whatever you got hurt, whatever the injuries are, 100% medical. Well, if you'll remember back in the 90s, the plaintiff's bar had got involved in that. It became so abusive that workers' comp rates were going through the roof. People were not getting taken care of. They were not going back to work. It was a terrible system. So we had to come in and reform workers' compensation, which we've done. I was involved with the second round of that. And our work comp system is great. I mean, it's one of the pluses for Texas. We turned it completely around from where it was to where it is now. 5 minutes? Somebody's already done with me already? No, okay. Another example that you'll remember was just the litigation abuse. You remember the 60-minute show talking about justice for sale in Texas, where the lawsuits had just gotten so ridiculous, the class actions, particularly all those things. We had to step in as a legislature to do the tort reform. A lot of battles on the way to try to get that squared away back to where it's a fair judicial system. And then more recently, we had the mold crisis. In our first session, 2003, we came in, insurance marketplaces had basically been shut down because the plaintiff's bar, on behalf of consumers, had suddenly discovered that mold, which has been around for thousands of years, was suddenly the bane of all, and people were actually picking up your trash in spacesuits. Things we used to use, things called Clorox on in a sponge, suddenly required people coming in spacesuits to do remediation, which basically meant the total loss of a home and rebuilding it because someone had mold under one of the bathroom counters. We had to come in legislative, Chairman Stingley and I served on that committee. We actually had to take care of the mold crisis. Well, now we're in another situation. This is the most recent, and it's catastrophe claims litigation. And we first became aware of it with Texas Windstorm Insurance Association. I first became aware of it when we had the slab claims, and to pay $100 million in claims for people who lost their homes completely, like on Bolivar Peninsula. They spent about $50 million in attorney costs. And this was not a long drawn-out process, and I just want to remind you, we're talking about property claims. This is a matter of how much does it cost to replace this divider. That takes a contractor and adjuster. There's really not a place for a lawyer in there, but this has now become the new mold or workers' comp, whatever you want to call it. And it's not just the Windstorm Association. We're now seeing it with hail claims. Any part of the state. Remember Bastrop, the fires? Y'all remember seeing some of the billboards that came up almost as soon as after the fires were over, advertising lawyers to come help you sue on this deal? How hard is it to settle a total loss? Your house is burned to the slab. That's called, what are the limits of your policy? You write on the check. There's no need for a lawyer in this. But this is now adding on the Windstorm, because I've been studying this very closely, it's added 30 to 40% on these claims costs for each claim that's been litigated. Hurricane Ike, now 5 years ago, how much time I got, 2 minutes yet? Hurricane Ike, 5 years ago, was estimated originally to be about a $1.3 to $1.5 billion total storm for Twia, windstorm pool. It is now, after 5 years of litigation, I'm talking about litigation that started not from day one, I'm talking about people's claims were settled, and 2 and 3 years later they would get lawsuits saying that they hadn't repaired all the damages. It's now a $2.7 billion loss. So we've added another $1 billion on top of what should have been a $1.3 or $1.5 billion storm. That affects consumers, because who pays for that? The wind pool is a microcosm of the whole insurance marketplace. It's like a co-op. So it's just the people within that pool are having to pay this. And now we're seeing it take place in other parts. We had a hailstorm, I believe, in Amarillo, and one of the chief plaintiffs on the Twia has now set up an office up there. We had a storm in some other South Texas, another hailstorm there, same thing. So this is something we're going to have to deal with as a legislator. Once again, we're going to take care of consumers. They're not being helped by raising the cost 30 and 40%. You all know we live in Texas. One of the most prominent places for I think we have 7 or 8 natural disasters that we're affected by in Texas. Yeah, we used to have earthquakes. We even got that now, but we have all these things that happen very frequently because where we're located geographically. So our rates for property insurance are always going to be a little on the higher end. If you start adding 30 to 40% on top of that, what are your rates going to be for the state of Texas? So that's one of the things we'll be working on here in the next session, and I look forward to working with Chairman Smith and others to help get a handle on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we have Representative John Smithy. Representative Smithy was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1984. He currently serves as chairman of the Insurance Committee, as co-chair of the Joint Insurance Committee on Seacoast Territory Insurance, and as a member of the Windstorm Insurance Legislative Oversight Board. He's also a proud member of the American Legislative Exchange Council and the Texas Conservative Coalition. Admitted to Texas State Bar in 1976, Representative Smithy is licensed to practice before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the U.S. Court of Claims, and the United States Supreme Court. Representative Smithy is a graduate of Amarillo College, as well as West Texas State University and Texas Tech School of Law, where he earned a business degree and his Juris Doctor, respectively. He and his wife, Becky, are blessed with 3 children and 3 grandchildren. Representative?
Thank you all very much. We're talking here today about the regulation of the marketplace, particularly from my standpoint as it deals with insurance, and that's a topic that's been debated for centuries. Adam Smith wrote about how you regulate things like utilities and insurance that most people have to have. for one reason or another. But in Texas right now, if you have any interest at all in economics, Texas presents a very interesting model or situation to look at it. And that is, on one hand, we have two markets here in Texas that are very similar in a lot of ways. On one hand, you have the homeowners market. Most everybody in here buys homeowners insurance. On the other market is the Texas automobile market, personal automobile market. Most everybody in here, I'm sure everybody, has a personal automobile policy. And so you have these two markets. Most of us participate in both markets. It's interesting that the identity of the buyers in both markets is remarkably similar. The identity of the sellers in both markets is fairly similar. Either these companies or through their affiliates, the State Farms, the Farmers, the Allstates, they sell both lines of policy. We have some companies that just write one or the other, more that write auto than that just write homeowners. But you see how differently these markets work in Texas. The other thing, they're both under the same regulatory system, essentially. Since 2003, both have been under a file and use system. But what we see with the automobile market is a market that has generally worked very well, a free market. I don't think there have been many occasions, if any, over the last 10 years when the commissioner of insurance, whoever that might have been at the time, had to come in and seriously contest an auto rate. Very few instances does that happen. Generally, the market takes care of the rate. The market sets a fair rate. If anybody tries to set the rate too high, if any company does, another company will come in and take business, because it's a very working market. It's a working, fair, free market that has worked very well, the auto market. On the other hand, we have the Texas homeowners market, which, as I say, very similar in so many ways. Another similarity that both markets have is they both have a relatively inelastic demand. And there's no real substitution of product that you can come up with as is important in a lot of economic and market decisions. For the most part, consumers have to have automobile insurance. The law requires it. If you're going to drive a vehicle, you've got to have automobile insurance or show some other form of responsibility. Virtually all drivers that have any responsibility that comply with that law comply through liability insurance. And on the other side, you've got the homeowners market, and you have a very inelastic demand there, because very few people can get a loan for a home unless they can get homeowners insurance. And by the same token, even after you don't have a loan on your home, for most people, it's either our biggest investment or one of our biggest, and we wouldn't think for a moment about not having insurance on our investment of our home. So you have these very similar markets. The auto market has worked very well, has required minimal, if any, regulation by the commissioner. But the homeowners market has behaved much differently. Typically, whenever a company has filed for a rate increase on a file and use, that so many times over the years that most people aren't even aware of, they file a rate or at least have a preliminary discussion with the department about a rate, and the commissioner will say, no, that's a little too much. A lot of this is done on an informal basis before the filing's ever made. And some of it's done on sort of an informal basis after the filing's made. Typically, the commissioners, whoever they have been over the years, have tried to intervene on a low key, not have a lot of publicity, and try to talk the insurer down on the rate. But the point is that the homeowners market has required a significant amount of oversight to try to keep rates down for consumers. And so you add, and then the other thing I should point out is, for the most part, the auto rate has been in Texas has been very profitable for insurers. It has typically been a profitable line of insurance. Homeowners, not so much. And you see many more companies, or some more companies, writing auto in Texas than write homeowners. And you also see a lot more advertising. People actually going out and trying to get automobile policies. You've seen the lizard commercials, all the commercials that are on TV, most of which are trying to get auto insurance. We see some homeowners commercials, the Mayhem, Allstate, the Mayhem guy that is on there. I've been seeing that a lot here lately. But most of those are national buys, national commercials. Texas is a very peculiar state for homeowners insurance. So you see these two things and you ask, what's the difference? And I mean, at least that's what I ask, is what's the difference? What makes the auto insurance market work as a fair market? What free market? What impedes the homeowners market from doing the same? And I'm convinced it's a supply problem on the homeowner side, and it's a capacity problem. And it results from the fact that we've never really had a free market here in Texas as far as the supply is concerned. And I say this with my coastal member Larry here, but one of the problems is the weather here in Texas. Where I'm from, we had more hail. We're in the hail belt in Amarillo. We get a lot of hail, and statistically that we can show that. Where Larry's from on the coast, they have the constant possibility, and it's not a probability, but a possibility, the certainty ultimately of a major hurricane. Insurers generally love, their favorite thing is predictability. That's what they live on, is predictability. If they can't have predictability, they opt for paranoia. And so in Texas, where there's no predictability, very little predictability to the weather outside of far west Texas, insurers tend to set rates based on paranoia and expect the worst, and generally are not disappointed when the worst actually comes. But we are a state, we have more weather catastrophes than any other state in the country. Not only that, we have a more wide variety, where you have tornadoes hitting in one part of the state with hailstorms, you have hurricanes hitting in another part mixed with a few tornadoes, and it makes for some pretty wild weather nights and a lot of insurance claims when those result. So the point of that is that some markets will work well with no regulation, and they will actually set a better, more truer, more accurate, more consumer-friendly price for the product than a regulator could set. On the other hand, some markets need some supervision. Now in Texas, we've gone both ways with homeowners. We went through a period where we had the most regulated system you can imagine. We had an actual set or promulgated rate by the department. That didn't work. That was back in the 50s and 60s. Then we went to a benchmark system several years after that, where we had a promulgated rate and insurers could deviate 30 on or 30 off the regulated insurers, but all the market migrated into an unregulated system. So it's been an odd situation in Texas, and I think we finally reached a balance where we'd like to be. One word before the time is up, and that's on title insurance. You know, title insurance is interesting because it's our most regulated form of insurance, a great regulated form of insurance we have. We're only one of 3 states, Texas, New Mexico, and Florida, that still regulate title rates. We also have probably the highest or among the highest rates in the country. I think one of the things we should look at over the next few sessions, at least look at, is the idea of going to a more of a deregulated system of setting rates with title insurance. You can do a file and use, you can do a lot of different things, but the lack of the regulated rate has resulted in 2 things. I think one is a higher than expected rate, and the other thing is a lack of innovation among the sellers, the suppliers, and that we're seeing in other states. And so we look at other states and what they're doing, and I think we can learn from some what to do and others what not to do. So thank you for the opportunity to speak here today and to visit with you on these, and look forward to hearing the others.
Next we have Representative Dan Flynn. Representative Flynn is in his 6th term representing House Districts 2, where he has gained a reputation as a fighter for the values of limited government and fiscal responsibility. In 2013, Representative Flynn was named East Texas Legislator of the Year for his principled conservative leadership. Representative Flynn serves as co-chairman of the House Select Committee on Transparency in State Agency Operations. He also serves as vice chair of the House Committee on Investments and Financial Services, and is a member of the House Committee on Homeland Security and Public Safety. In addition, Representative Flynn is an active member of both the National Conference of State Legislators as well as the Legislative Exchange Council. Representative Flynn is a native Texan, has had a distinguished career in the banking industry, including serving as the Deputy Banking Commissioner for the state of Texas. He has served as a consultant in the financial and banking industries in Texas, nationally and internationally. Representative Flynn lives with his wife Susan in Van, Texas, where they are active members of their church. Representative?
Thank you, and I really wanted to talk about my NFL career. And I remember that when I got out of high school, there was absolutely no desire to have little short, fat, slow boys. But I didn't get to do a whole lot of that, so what I did instead was I went from all the applause of being an NFL great to a bank examiner, and I got to hear all the jeers of all the people that really appreciated having bank regulation. But it was a great session when I came here, my first session, when we started talking about payday loans. And I'm sure everybody in this room knows about payday loans. I would bet you that most of you have a lot of misinformation about what payday loans do and what's going on with them. My first session, I fought hard against payday loans. And we defeated the bill that came out, and one of my dearest friends was on the security bill, so that helped my legislative career just move right along. And the next session, I sat down and visited with a lot of folks, and I said, you know what, there is a market for this, but what we need to do is we need to get all of these folks together. And we did. We had a great bill, it was House Bill 846, and it was a bill that we had everyone in the industry on. And I thought it would just be a slam dunk deal, but like I said, this is my second session. I still hadn't learned that there's these things called points of order, there's all this kind of stuff that all of a sudden, what we think is great goes down in flames real quick. At that point, we really felt like that was a missed opportunity. And as I've gone through my sessions, I looked at that industry, continued to look at it, and just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page, I just want sort of the definition that I have of payday lending is that it's a small, unsecured, short-term cash advance until payday. Customers choose payday advances to cover small expenses, avoid costly bounce check fees or late penalties. Other less desirable short-term credit options. A customer with an active, in order to get a payday loan, you have to have an active bank account, you have to have a job, and you have to be able to qualify for those things. You don't have to have good credit. In fact, they don't even check your credit. The customers check, what happens is you go in and you apply for a loan, and it's a very short, quick thing that happens. There's no question about it. Why is the rates high? The rates are high because the risks are very high, simply because no one, you're lending to people that have no credit rating. Your loss factor is substantial. Having spent a long time in the banking industry and a lot of it as a regulator, I promise you, there are people that don't understand debts. I know, it's surprising to a lot of people, but that does happen. And I felt like that one of the things that we needed to do was, the market's there. It's there because all you have to do is look at the numbers, millions of dollars in outstanding credit. I don't know how a banker and a bank regulator ended up being in the payday lending business, because it just wasn't the direction that I intended to go when I got in the legislature. But for some reason, that's kind of, it's fallen under the committees that I've worked with, and every session we've had some attempts to do something. But the industry, certainly, they kind of came together back on House Bill 846, back in the 05 session. And then they were defeated soundly, and when they were defeated, well, it's kind of interesting, this last session, so many of the people that defeated it in that session came to me and says, you know, we sure wish we got on board with your bill back when we did it, we wouldn't be here today, because we are. It's kind of an incredible deal. We've done a survey, and as an elected official in the industry, we have a responsibility, I believe, to protect the interests as well as serving needs of people. In a survey of low-income people, we found out that 60% of those that we surveyed, their families turned to friends or relatives for short-term loans. 40% indicate they were denied loans at banks and credit unions, and then there's 23% chose to borrow from a payday lender. And of those that did borrow and those that did participate, 50% of them, they needed a short-term loan to pay a bill. 46% needed money for gas or groceries. Over a third of the people surveyed used payday loans were faced with some kind of emergency situation. And a lot of them just wanted money to go purchase an item. I know I live in a small community. Has anybody ever heard of Canton, Texas? It's home of the world famous flea market. And we become about the 5th or 6th largest city in Texas, month to month. We have thousands of people that come and participate in that great exercise. My office is kind of down there in one of the centers, and I noticed that there were a number of lenders that were propping up, and I'm thinking, you know, what in the world, why are they coming here? Well, I found out that what happens is the payday lenders there perform a great service. Wives will come down and they'll get this great idea that they need this very important antique, very valuable antique, I'm sure, and they want it, and they didn't have the money, and they didn't want their spouse to know that they were going to run out. So they go out there and buy it, and then their next payday, well, they're paying it off, and it's performing a useful function and service for them. Like I say, here again, it seems like we're always saying that this is a cycle of debt for poor folks, when if you look at the demographics of the people that use those, it's not just one segment of the population. Another thing that I think is very, very interesting, you know, running an industry out of the state, I mean, you're not going to do away with short-term lending. You know, what you're going to do is you're going to move it either to the internet, or you're going to move it to another state. And just to kind of give you an idea of what the statewide impact is for the payday lending, there's over 3,000 payday store locations in Texas. They employ almost 10,000 people with salaries and benefits of $365 million. They pay $6.4 million in franchise taxes. They pay property taxes of $7.2 million. The Office of the Consumer Credit Commissioner, they make $2.25 million in fees that are collected by their examination of these institutions. And then, of course, there's about $74 million that's paid on rent to store locations. So we're not talking about an industry that if it just moves out, we wouldn't recognize it as having been gone. That we would see a real, it would be a downturn in our economy. But the most concerning thing to me is what happens because these people are going to continue to have a need. Like I said, I was a bank regulator and a banker for many years. And quite frankly, the last time I was a CEO of a bank, our minimum loan was around $10,000. You start finding out who in the world can loan someone $300 to $500. And I want to tell you, I don't care how big a corporation is, if you have a need for several million, you have a need. But if you're a small salaried person and you need $300 to $500, you need it. And there needs to be a place for you to be able to do it. And just to kind of wrap up, I'll tell you this. Everybody talks about the rates and whatever. Listen to fee loan. If you have a $100 small short-term loan, it's about 390% is what the interest rate is. But it's a fee. They continue to want to talk about the interest rate. If you have a credit card balance, anybody ever get over a limit on your credit card? Let me tell you what, that can be about a 756% interest rate. Have you ever had a hot check? I'm sure in this room no one's ever done that. And like I said, I was in the banking business for years and years. I had hot checks in my bank. But that can end up being about 1,825%. Yeah. So I think the big thing is it is something that needs to be regulated. As a former regulator, I believe it is something we need to get together. And it's always disturbing to me that there's two definite sides. We all need to come together. And I think it can happen. I would encourage leadership in the House to be sure we can put together some kind of a select committee so that we can come together and find something that not only helps the industry, but also the consumer. Thank you.
Director of Public Citizens Texas Office since 1985. He's testified over 1,000 times on energy and other issues with the Texas legislature and Congress. One of his core accomplishments has been the passage of Texas New Portfolio Standards, which has led to over 10,000 megawatts of wind being installed in Texas. He has won over a dozen awards for his advocacy, including the Heinz Award, and recently was recognized by Political Magazine as one of the 25 most influential Democrats in Texas. In former lives, Sonny served as the Food Bank Development Coordinator for Second Harvest Food, developing food banks across 10-state region in the southern United States. He became addicted to Texas policy when he served as Texas legislative aide to State Representative Al Price from 1982 to 1985. He was the initial director of the Houston Food Bank and was legal assistant with Texas Rural Legal Aid and later with Prairie State Legal Services. Sonny received a Bachelor of Arts in 1974. He became a Texan by choice shortly thereafter.
I'm honored to be on this panel, and as somebody pointed out, I'm on the left edge of the panel. I'm sure most of you who know me would be surprised to see that. I think it's important to reflect for a second on why we regulate and how long we've been regulating. There are a lot of biblical provisions or exhortations to regulate your behavior, to leave 10% of your crops for the poor, to not do all sorts of things that are part of the Ten Commandments. And that's some of the earliest regulatory structures and strictures that predate, in many ways, the New Testament as well, and you go way back in the Old Testament. But when you look at sort of modern regulatory policy, one of the things you look at in the history of it is why is we regulate? And let's go back one. So the biggest thing is protection of commons. Back in the old days, we wanted to make sure that nobody grazed too much in the common pastures, to keep our water safe to drink and our air clean enough to breathe, to protect public safety. We don't need drunks driving and stuff like that. This is a big one, to protect between the balances of the regulated industries and the consumers who often don't have adequate information or equal power in the law, and also to come up with ways to resolve complaints easily, quickly, and more cheaply than going to court. I think you all have a pretty good sense of what we regulate. The biggest area is professions. We don't want to have doctors that aren't licensed or lawyers that don't get educated. And we also regulate trade to make sure that the information we're given when we buy an insurance policy or get a payday loan is adequate to make sure that we know what we're getting ourselves into. We regulate the environment, building safety, to make sure that the doors go out so we don't get trapped in if there's a fire, that the building is strong enough. Mineral exploitation, which is a big thing in Texas. Reclamation, so we clean up the messes that get made, utilities, transportation, etc. Now there's a regulatory balance, and I think everybody in this room knows that sometimes we go too far over-regulating stuff, and sometimes we don't regulate enough. When we do too little, consumers get abused, we have poorly qualified trades, we have permits and licenses that aren't reviewed adequately, and the penalties are too small to deter behavior. Today in Texas, that seems to be much the case. If you get popped for a fracking violation, it's less than you're going to make on a daily basis operating a fracking rig. But if you do too much, you protect incumbents, you keep out people who might challenge the status quo, and you restrict innovation. You slow down permits to the point that people say, well, how will we go to Louisiana or someplace like that? You restrain commerce, and the penalties are too tough, and you put people out of business, and none of us want to do that. Now, where we are, there's a classic thing that they call the regulatory agency death spiral. Regulated agencies oftentimes come in with good intent, but they get weakened by the board appointments because they're underfunded, because of congressional and legislative oversight that goes too far, lawsuits, and unequal input. And as a lobbyist that frequently faces odds where you have 100 people in the insurance industry versus 2 or 3 in the consumer side or in the environment or whatever, you see the same thing happening at the regulatory agencies. And you go into the PUC and there are 2 or 3 consumer advocates and literally 100 or more people working for the electric utilities. So if you look at the best practices versus what you frequently see here in Texas, and my job, of course, is to be a little bit controversial, You have clear legislative guidance, qualified board members, open processes, adequate budgets, and budget authority where they can spend the money on what it's supposed to be spent for, clear rules, strong penalties, and independent public counsels and regulatory judges. What we see today in Texas, unfortunately, is board members oftentimes dominated by donors. Agencies fight open records requests and don't adequately inform consumers what's going on. Regulated industries typically pay the fees to operate the regulatory agencies and thus have a disproportionate say when it comes to allocation of those fees in the legislative end. Funds are frequently sequestered by the legislature. And Governor Perry and I are on the same side. I know you're all going to gasp about that. When we say it's inappropriate to be taking money that's been set aside for a regulatory agency and keep it to balance the budget. That doesn't make sense, and it keeps the agencies from doing their jobs, or it overtaxes us. Inadequate bonds, inadequate penalties, and dependent or non-existent public counsels or judges. Now, here's a current example, and this is one where the Texas Public Policy Foundation and the consumer groups and the environmental groups are on the same side. It's a very weird moment. We're all checking our cards to make sure this is something that's supposed to be happening. But at the Public Utilities Commission, there's a big debate on how we're going to keep the lights on the hottest summer afternoons or on the coldest mornings. We want to go to a capacity market where generators are paid for just existing and maybe being called upon to provide electricity, or do we want to stick with our energy market, which is unique in the United States, and pay people for only doing, for generating electricity only when they actually operate? So who pays for cold days like we had the other night, or the other morning? On January 6th, we had 3,700 megawatts of electricity drop off the grid, fairly close to rolling blackouts. The current PUC rules reward all generators every time they hit a peak, and the price went from about $50 up to $5,000 a megawatt hour, a 100-fold increase, and everybody, whether or not they participated in solving the problem, got paid that was generating electricity at that day. That's a system that is so broken that it rewards people for creating risk. And as a result, while some of those plants may have gone offline because of pipe burst, others may have consciously decided to withhold electricity in order to make money on a cold day. And it forces consumers to pay a lot more, and what it's going to end up costing us is maybe $10 for 2.5 hours of energy on that really cold day. Now, I want to point out that recent blackouts have been caused not by not having enough generators, but typically because of cold weather. And that's an act of God. It's not an act of not having enough power plants up. So one of the questions that we're having is, if you look at the numbers, you can see over here on the 6th just how high the price went on a spike, up to $5,000 and dropped back down. The next day, it stayed high all day long, partially because it was coldest, but also because people were looking at how to make some money off the deal. But in both cases, we had plenty of power to keep the lights on. So what's it would cost to go to a capacity market? Commissioner Anderson has said about $395 per meter per year, $33 a month. What gets built? Gas turbines. If you have an energy market that's working well, who's going to end up paying for it? You end up paying the occasional price spike, maybe $10 a day. And what gets built? Ways to reduce demand for electricity, to conserve electricity. And the people who benefit from that are the large industrial consumers, commercial consumers, and residential consumers if we set up the market right. Energy storage is going to come on, just like our batteries and our telephones are now 10 times as powerful and 100 times the weight. The capacity of energy storage with new battery technologies is coming on market very quickly. So we have to ask ourselves, so why is the PUC protecting the corporations and not the consumers? This is an environmental issue I want to bring to your attention. And again, it goes to the commons, but also the common good. Rich Kinder, the richest man in Houston, was going to build a new coal export terminal. Lots of fine dust particles are going to blow off that. That's the essence of coal. You get a lot of wind over it, you get dust blowing everywhere. Unfortunately, that's regulated, or fortunately, from my perspective, it's regulated by the federal government, and we are perilously close to violating that standard in Houston. And if we violate it, we're literally going to have to spend $1 billion to reduce air pollution for ministry and individuals all over Houston. TCEQ, unfortunately, has allowed a lot of this to be permitted by rule. And as a result, you don't ever look at the total impact of it. But yet in Tampa, Florida, Rich Kinder owns one that's entirely covered. In Texas, it's going to be open because it's each individual unit permitted by rule. What kind of sense does this make if everybody else is going to have to pay to clean up the mess that one company makes? So what we're saying here is that regulation does serve a vital function to protect us from pollution, to keep our commons safe, to make sure that public safety works, to allow for low-cost dispute resolutions. But in Texas today, we need to regain that balance. And I'm with you on many things. Oftentimes we over-regulate and stuff doesn't happen well. But we need to make sure the board members are really working for us, that we have regulated industries who pay for the regulation, but that money actually goes to the purposes for which it was intended and for which those industries are taxed. And that we make sure that the penalties and the bonds are adequate to clean up the mess we make or to deter bad behavior. We need to take back our regulatory system and make sure it protects the people and not the powerful. Thank you all very much for your time.
Before I open up to questions, I just want to see, does any of the panelists have a response to what you've heard so far today?
I was just glad to hear Smitty quote the Bible. And I'm looking forward to him helping me on my 10 Commandments book. He's a really big deal. So I appreciate that.
Good to hear. Okay, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. If you can please go by the mic and line up there. I'm going to start though, just kind of going off of what Smitty said and also a little bit of what we've heard from the other panelists. This idea of a regulatory balance between the need to protect consumers, but also the fear that you're going to overregulate and lead to very disruptive consequences. And one of the problems with finding a regulatory balance is that the regulatory process tends to be captured either by special interests, both on the industry side and of course also on certain constituency side as well. So my question is really, how do we avoid having that regulatory process captured by special interests? Is there a way to do that, or is that temptation always present?
I've had the opportunity and privilege to be on both sides of that issue as a regulator and someone that was in the industry, and obviously there are personalities that are dominating when they go in and talk to regulators, but then we've got in Texas we have some pretty strong regulators, and I know the tenure that I had as a regulator, I don't ever remember feeling that I had to bend over for anybody from the regulatory standpoint or from the industry standpoint. I felt like we had a pretty good mix there, and I think that the biggest problem that we as regulators need to remember, and as legislators, you need to sit down and listen to people. Get the information out there, and I appreciate working with Smitty because he always has a strong opinion of where to protect consumers, and I believe strongly in a free enterprise system, and I think that it can work hand in hand so that you can accommodate both sides.
And I'll just add that, I mean, what we find in the legislature is there are generally at least two sides to every story. Sometimes there's more. And I think from the legislative perspective, it's very important we bring both sides together, and generally most of these types of compromise, it is in fact a compromise. I mean, the payday loan was a perfect example we just experienced last session. You're going to have to bring all sides of the table and talk about what we can do to make sure it's right for everybody. And that's the only way that bill is going to ever be done, because there's powerful interests on both sides that you've experienced for how many sessions now. And we were very close last session to getting that done. And I'll just add this. We can't have it done across the state of Texas city by city. This patchwork of regulation, de facto regulation by city, is not a good business practice for anyone. But we need to come together and on any issue. We've been in many discussions on insurance, other issues, and it's a matter of having reasonable people on both sides of the table that are willing to come together and talk about it and find where that compromise and that position is. And I know it sounds like a bad word these days, but you've got to find that middle ground to make these things work, because it is a balancing act.
I'll add one other thing, that over the years in Texas we have created something called the Sunset Commission. And one of the purposes of the Sunset Commission was to get rid of dead agencies that were no longer functioning. And I think there are about 250 odd agencies, more or less. We've gotten rid of about 10% of the agencies in the state of Texas, and then we've added about 10% more agencies. So we're about 250 after 30 years of this experience. But what is important, and was for many years the sort of the norm, is we made significant policy updates and rebalanced the system as part of our sunset process. But here in the last 3 sessions, we've gotten away from that and just talk about little minor modifications, as opposed to really looking at the function of the agency and updating it to make sure that whatever it is they're trying to regulate, we do regulate well, and that we're regulating cell phones as opposed to landlines and that kind of stuff.
Any questions for our panelists?
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Smithy. You mentioned title insurance, and I know last session there was a title insurance reform bill before the insurance committee, which was endorsed by TPPF, and I asked some interesting questions about it. For example, why does Texas have the highest premiums, while at the same time having the lowest payment of claims? And basically, my question is why that bill was not moved out of committee, and what you'd be looking for in a bill that would move through next session.
Well, I think that, the reason it wasn't moved out of committee, I don't think it ever had the votes to get out of committee. The title insurance lobby is very powerful. They have always resisted any effort to change basically the status quo. And so I think that any effort, there's going to have to be a fairly orchestrated effort on the part of anybody who wants to make any substantial changes to do that, to try to get the votes. And I think to some extent that's an education process. And there have been bills in the past. I've filed bills in the past. But there's never really been a serious, concentrated effort to try to make any changes in the market, and it's going to require some education of the public, also education, I think, of the legislators themselves to try to be able to move that forward.
Next question.
And I came in late, so I apologize if you all addressed this, but it's something that's been on my mind for quite a while. I'm an attorney that's dealt with regulated industries and consumer protection in one form or another for pretty much my entire career here. And it seems to me that in consumer protection, we're dealing with, or we ought to be dealing with, the bad actors. And in my experience, that's, even though that may be a very flagrant bad actors, that's a fairly small percentage of the overall population of licensees or regulated entities or whatever it is. And why couldn't Texas do something fairly radical in this arena? We have on the books, as most states do, a really good, strong Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act. We've got an Attorney General that enforces that. We've got regional offices. Could we not curtail or eliminate the powers of a number of these agencies who don't have enough resources, and so they pass new regulations because they don't have enough resources, do away with a bunch of that, and just hire, I don't know, a couple of hundred more assistant AGs and enforce the Deceptive Trade Practices Act on the really bad guys instead? I'm wondering what the panel thinks about that.
I couldn't agree with you more. In my district, so much of what we have to respond to is folks that come in the office and they're talking about this law or that law. And I always have to ask them, now, wait a minute, is it a law or is it a regulation? And legislators, and everybody has their own opinion, but I feel like that for the most part, when you draft a bill and you pass the bill, you have some intent of what you want to see happen. And then it does go to the bureaucracy, and then you have a group of folks that start writing rules and regulations, and the next thing you know, the author of the bill hardly recognizes what he passed or she passed. And that is that's a constant issue, and I agree with Smitty on the Sunset Commission. You know, it's not perfect. I wish we had one in Washington. It would be something that would be very good from their standpoint. I think that we're fortunate. I work with a lot of other states, and they're constantly asking me about our Sunset Commission. I think we've done some great things. We did have cut out a lot of agencies, and we bring others, but that's a growing part of what happens as we go through the process, because there are other issues that come up, and you know, you have to have some kind of regulatory fight. And before I turn loose this, I want to agree with Senator Larry there. He brought up about regulating things on a city. We can't allow that. If we're going to have a state agency, the state agency's got to regulate those industries. I mean, I can't imagine if you take one little thing and say, we're going to let them regulate this, next thing you know, it's going to be, the cities will have their own health department. The cities will have that'll oversee the state law. We'll have everything that you can imagine on the state level, we'd have it on the city level. What would that happen? We think we have high taxes. We think we have a lot of bureaucracy. That's exactly what would happen. That's why we have state agencies to look after those issues.
And along those lines, can you imagine what would happen if Texas on the state level and the federal government on the federal level were to go in and look at every regulation on the books and do a true and an independent cost-benefit analysis and say, okay, we're going to get rid of everyone that doesn't make sense. Every regulation out there we're just going to get rid of. Can you imagine what that would do to American business? The dream would come back alive to some extent. And not only that, but the agencies that enforce these rules would actually have the resources to enforce the rules that really matter. The rules that I think Smitty is concerned about, that really do protect people. We would have the resources and the ability to make sure those are done. And so it would be the best thing I think America could do, and the state of Texas could do, as far as an economic entity.
We have time for one short question. I'm the wrong guy for that. Right, Senator?
As a fellow senator, these guys can't ask a question in less than 5 minutes. You have 21 votes on that.
Time's up. No, I just wanted to comment, first of all, to congratulate the panel. I thought that it was an excellent presentation by all of you, and I have a lot of respect for the chairman up here, Smitty and Flynn. And Smitty, you're not a chairman, but Flynn and Smithy. And I just wanted to react to some of the comments about the regulatory process. And it seems to me that the prior question about, for example, the Consumer Protection Act, the Deceptive Business Practices Act. You know, in my other life, I started out as a legal services lawyer. I spent a lot of time in the late 70s after that statute came into effect, in fact, handling those kinds of cases. And it's an example where, as initially enacted, it was a good tool to address consumer protection issues, deceptive business practices and the like. But over a period of time, my view is that that particular statute has been diminished in its effectiveness. You know, the definitions of what's a deceptive business practice, for example, have been changed, and there's been some other changes that make it more difficult to use it to control the unscrupulous practices that the statute was intended to address. So I think it's an example of what Smitty was talking about balance. On the one hand, the law has been watered down, in my view. Secondly, it was mentioned the Attorney General's office can handle these cases. Well, I was the elected county attorney in El Paso for almost 20 years, and did some consumer protection, but didn't have quite the authority that the AG has, and worked very closely with the Attorney General's office, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat, and felt very strongly about those cases. But eventually, the staffing was reduced. The office in El Paso, for example, wasn't taking any more of the cases that I used to work with them jointly. And so I think we need to look at these things from different perspectives to be able to come to the conclusion that we're all trying to reach, which is it too much regulatory burden? And if it is, let's do something about it. But if it's not, then, you know, we maybe need some more in order to address the problems that we face in the consumer arena. That's my point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, with that, unless there's a short response.
I would just say one thing. A lot of times as legislators, once again, we have to exercise legislative restraint. We get problems brought to us sometimes of a nefarious act, someone's been doing a terrible thing, and generally there's already laws in place that could take care of that, but we end up coming in as a legislature and the old proverbial sledgehammer going after a fly. And we end up affecting a lot of other people who are doing business exactly what they should have been doing, but now we pass this new regulation to go after that one bad actor. It affects everyone else. It makes everyone's life miserable because that one that should have been fixed under any number of statutes, they were violating and doing what they were doing. So we have to a lot of times exercise a little restraint and not getting all up in arms, ready to go start up with a new law, which is what we do. A lot of times we just need to enforce what we already have.
All right, with that, we're going to close the panel. I'd like to thank our panelists.